Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. It's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode I'll be making a vase from 15 maple segmented rings with a mix of resin and solid glued joints, and I'll be trying a new finishing method called crackle glazing. So without further ado, let's get into it. For this project I'll be using more of the recently acquired maple. It's cut down into half a dozen lengths at around 25mm thick. And for a while now, I haven't been spending a lot of time preparing the timber to exact measurements. And mostly I've got away with it. But as you'll see later, taking that approach on this project doesn't quite work out for getting the best results. Timber cut, I then went straight over to the table saw to cut the segments. There's 15 rings with 12 segments, so that's 180 individual pieces. Segments cut, I glued up the first set of rings. These are for the feature midsection and the feature section in the neck. Each segment has a liberal amount of glue applied to just one side, then the ring is loosely assembled in a circle, then a hose clamp is used to tighten the joints, making sure to keep one side as flat as possible. I'll just show 2 rings being assembled. In total, I did 4 for the midsection and 2 for the neck. It's the next day and the rings are ready for sanding. This is done with a drum sander. Each ring is passed through, keeping the flattest side down on the belt. The rings are then flipped over when the top side is levelled. Some rings require more sanding than others, so they end up at slightly different thicknesses, but that's not a problem for this project. The 2 smaller rings wouldn't go through the sander, so I levelled them on the lathe. Each end was faced off and checked for flatness. And whilst it was in the lathe, I glued them together, using the tailstock to add the required pressure and keep them centred. Having done the smaller rings, I used the same method to assemble the midsection. With the first ring firmly held in place in the coal jaws, glue was added, then the next ring was offered up and clamped in position with the tailstock. I then waited for 20 minutes, added more glue to the next ring and clamped another ring in place. This was repeated until all 4 rings were glued together, making sure that the segment joints half lapped each other. Last ring in position, it was left for 24 hours for the glue to cure. Next I began assembling the sections that would be cast in epoxy resin. And this time I tried something a bit different to my normal method. Instead of using the large template, I built up the rings straight onto the 3D printed spacers. supergluing the segments in place one at a time. The spacers are positioned in such a way that they'll be cut out of the finished piece, or if that's not possible, then they'll be buried deep inside where they can't be seen. And something new that I've learned was that when using superglue with an activator, it gets very hot. So be careful with those pinkies, it can be very painful. That's the first ring done. Now for the next ring on top. For this I used mixing sticks to act as a joint spacer and began adding the segments one by one until the ring was full. This worked great until it came to pressing the spacer in the top. I got it glued in place eventually, but I used a different method on the next assembly. For the second assembly, I glued in place opposing segments to quarter the ring and glued the next spacer on top as I went along, filling in the gaps until it was complete. The next two rings were done in the same way until it was done, but this is where the problem of not cutting the timber to exact dimensions showed up. Some pieces were thicker than others, so this created inconsistent horizontal joint widths. I sort of got away with it, but next time I'll have to be more careful. I made 3 ring assemblies that will be cast in epoxy resin, the base with 3 rings, the upper midsection with 4 rings, and the rim neck section with 2 rings. To form some kind of a mould around each one, I wrapped them in clear packing tape. I chose to do it that way because I didn't have any silicone moulds to suit. However, I want to give a shout out to Dave, a friend of the channel. Thanks to him, I've now discovered that I can make my own custom silicone moulds, so I hope to begin incorporating that into my future projects. So thanks once again, Dave, and many thanks for the fusion file. And another big thanks has to go to Will at Tendring Woodturning. He contacted me about a quick way to stabilise the timber segments to stop them soaking up epoxy, and that is to use a spray-on lacquer. As I was in the middle of wrapping the segmented rings, Amazon turned up with my order of high coat clear lacquer. It's the cheapest one I could find. Ideally I would have sprayed the segments before gluing the assembly, but I decided to give it a go and see if it would make a difference at this later stage. I'll add a link to Will's channel in the video description. This brings me on to this episode's sponsor, T-Expert, my favoured brand of epoxy resin. They offer a range of epoxy resin products, including clear casting resin, deep pour resin, fast curing, and all-in-one resin kits to get you started. I'll leave a link to the website and a 10% discount code in the video description. I thought this project would require 4 batches, so with each of the mixing cups filled with equal parts of part A and part B, I added black mica powder, Not as much as usual because I was running out, so I topped up with a few squirts of black alcohol dye. Each batch was thoroughly mixed for a minimum of 2 minutes. Each part was placed into a container to catch any leaks, and the resin was poured in. No need to pre-cure, as it was just a single colour, and I wanted to see how the lacquer would perform. The first thing is I mixed too much, and this is the first time I'd done that. Normally I have to mix extra. Was this to do with the lacquer? I don't know. But anywho, when they were filled, each one was stacked into the pressure pot, 50 to 55 psi added, and there they stayed to cure overnight. It's the next day and the lacquer has worked. I checked the casting after 6 hours cure time, and the level had gone down to expose the very top of the segments, which I did top up with more black epoxy, but it was nothing like it normally is. So, thanks once again, Will. Top tip. And the glued up sections had cured as well. First the neck feature rings, and then the midsection feature rings. Whilst it doesn't look like it, this is how each of the pieces will stack up to form the finished item. Now we're into the cleanup. First to go is the base. All I need to do at this stage is remove most of the excess resin, level and flatten either end, ready for bonding the pieces together. With most of the rubbish removed, I could see the blank wasn't centred at the tailstock, so I made a quick adjustment and got on with flattening the underside and cutting the mortise. Mortise cut, I sanded just the underside to 800 grit, sealed the timber with sanding sealer, de-nibbed, and then I used a spray-on varnish. I'll come back to that later. I refixed the base on the 4-jaw chuck and set about forming a rough shape to the outside. Then I switched to hollowing out. Because of the shape, I would have to hollow out each piece as I went along. A couple of sections would still be accessible for finishing after they were bonded together, but I had to be careful not to paint myself into a corner, so to speak, if that makes sense. I'll explain as I go along. I tried with a bowl gouge, but the resin and maple mix was better suited to the negative rate carbide. This just chewed through the waste material without chipping the epoxy resin joints. The skew chisel took care of flattening the gluing surface, and it was ready for the next section to be bonded in place. I used my usual 5-minute epoxy mixed without any colourant, spread it evenly over the surface, then the midsection was offered up with a 3D printed 2mm thick ring glued to it. Then I used the tailstock to squeeze the two sections together, paying particular attention to the joint alignment. It's a few minutes later and the epoxy has cured. With the blank held tight between the tailstock and chuck, I began cutting away outer layers of timber from the midsection, then blending it down into the base. What I'm trying to do here is remove a low spot in the base between the first and second ring. To achieve this, I had to reduce the diameter of the bottom ring. I ended up being very close to the edge of the chuck, but I got there in the end. The large negative rake scraper and the skew do a great job at refining the surface, but I have to keep the skew razor sharp to keep any tear out down to a minimum. Once the outer surface was close to where it needed to be, I began hollowing out. The midsection had a lot of thickness to it, and I had to reduce it to get rid of the weight. The last thing I needed was a catch, so I used the mid-sized carbide with a brand new cutter installed on it. This effortlessly cut into the maple segments. The only downside was the noise. I've never heard it resonate and screech so badly. So much so the audio was clipping, leaving the sound file mostly unusable. But I'll try and play a bit without any music, so you can get a taste of what it was like. Yeah, it's not really coming through, but as you can see, I switched to the large negative rate carbide, which was a bit better, but in the end, the only way to keep the noise down was to use the side cutting scraper. I hardly put any pressure on the cutting edge, I just allowed it to skim the surface, and this was enough to remove huge quantities of material. And that was that. I could have taken a bit more out, but enough was enough. My head was ringing, even though I was using the ear protection on my Air Shield Pro. I sanded from 80 to 800 grit and applied the same finish as before, topped off with a spray-on varnish. So with the lower half put to one side, I now have the upper midsection on the lathe. This needs to be cleaned off down to the segmented rings, the inside hollowed out and a finish applied. The carbide cutter made quick work of roughing out the outer surface. I only go down till the joints between the rings thin out. Then I know I'm close to the finished shape. The rest will be done when it's fully assembled. I had to reduce the diameter on the end so I could get my 4-jaw chuck to fit. Once it was centered and tight, I could refix the workpiece to the lathe and get access to the inside to hollow it out. The mid-sized carbide completed the waste material removal, then I sanded just the inside to 800 grit and added the spray varnish. Then the rim and neck needed some work. First I removed the outer material, then levelled the underside and drilled a 30mm hole down the centre. Next, the feature ring for the neck could be bonded in place with a 3D printed spacer sandwiched in the joint, remembering to keep the joint staggered and the two pieces centered. After turning the piece around, I could drill a 30mm hole through to the hole in the upper neck, turn the piece around once more and complete the hole all the way. Then whilst I had the chuck in the tailstock, I used a 45mm Forstner bit to excavate some more of the waste. Then it was on to shaping the inside of the rim section, and I knew I wouldn't be able to work on this part when it was fully assembled because the tailstock will be in the way. So this would need to be fully finished all the way down into the neck. That's the last piece done. Now I could begin bonding it all together. I clamped the base section firmly to the lathe and mixed some 5-minute epoxy. This was spread over the end, then the upper midsection was offered up and pressure applied via the tailstock. The joints aligned, and this time I was only really bothered about the joints running top to bottom being in alignment, and it was then left for a few minutes to cure. And to make the piece complete, I bonded the top section in place using some more 5-minute epoxy. The joints were aligned and then it was left overnight. It's now 2 days later and at last I can begin the final shaping and finishing. I began with a large negative rate carbide, trimming down the 3D printed spacers, then I set about blending each section into continuous flowing curves. When I'd done as much as I could with the carbide, I switched to the large negative rate scraper. With this I was able to refine the surface, removing the fine tool marks, varying the curves, stopping frequently and using my fingertips to feel for any inconsistencies. To finish blending the feature midsection, I used the skew with a freshly sharpened cutting edge to scrape the surface down into the base and up into the midsection, being careful not to go too high for fear of cutting into the curved neck. And with that done, the shaping was finished. I sanded from 80 to 800 grit and then cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Then I applied 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. And that's it for my normal finishing technique. Now for something a bit different. Masking tape. I'll be applying a Crackle glaze finish, but only to the solid parts in the midsection and the neck. I applied the masking tape so that it covered the black joint. I'm using a thinner tape as it's easier to bend around the compound curves. Once the blue tape had been applied, it was an easy job to mask the rest off with wider masking tape. I'll just show the lower section being done. The rest was finished in the same way. The paint system I'm using is made by Montana. This is Montana Gold, specifically made to work with the Crackle glaze top coat. After rigorously shaking the can, I sprayed a number of layers, beginning with a fine first coat. The gold in the paint name does not refer to the colour. Gold is the finished type, this one being a satin. And if I understand correctly, this is also a low pressure lacquer, which is available in many different colours. Once the paint had been applied, I think I did 4 coats, I left it to cure before adding more masking tape. The idea for this round of masking is to add some gold pinstriping to inject a bit more interest. Taping done, it was time to add the crackle effect. I sprayed this in a single coat in a crosshatch pattern to get as even a coverage as I could. This has to be done a minimum of 45 minutes after the last base coat and no more than 24 hours later. Crackle effect done, all you can do is sit back and wait. This clip is speeded up 900 times. Okay, so the sensible thing to do at this point is wait a few hours before carefully removing the masking tape. But I was eager to see the result, so I got straight into it, and well, there's no easy way to say it, I buggered it up. In my haste to see the end result, I went at the masking a bit too heavy and pulled some of the gold paint off in the pinstriping. No problem, I thought. I'll just mask that bit off and spray some gold on it, which worked incredibly well. Then I removed the rest of the masking tape, and you can't see it very easily, but I pulled a bit more paint off. And this wasn't all I did wrong. If you read the Crackle coat instructions, it clearly states, do not apply a varnish top coat for at least 24 hours. But I didn't read the instructions, so I proceeded to apply multiple coats of Montana varnish. Having applied the varnish, it appeared to be very patchy, which I thought I could fix with a heat gun. This made things 10 times worse. The heat made the varnish bloom, and it also bubbled it, giving it an orange peel texture. Now I think my only defence for rushing this was time, and I was running out of it. There was only one way forward, and that was to go back to the beginning, just on the midsection. So out came the skew, and off came the crackle glaze. Somehow the neck had come through it all in perfect condition, so I left that alone. After a careful sanding, then remasking, I reapplied the gold base coat. Left it for 1 hour, added more masking, then reapplied the crackle effect, this time in a heavier single coat. And this is the crackle effect, speeded up 900 times normal speed. Lesson learned, there it stayed for 24 hours. It's the next day, and with the last of the masking removed, the first thing to note is how matte the crackle paint has cured. That surprised me, and as careful as I was, a small section of paint lifted, but that was quickly repaired. Then it was onto the varnish. I only had 1/3 of a can left, so I applied as many layers as I could. In the end, I think I got 3 full coats, each one sprayed 10 minutes after the other. That's it, another project finished, and what a project. I'm not sure if it came through in the video, but the time spent on this really caught me out. I honestly thought it would be a quick and easy thing to do. I had it all drawn up in CAD, so I knew exactly what I needed, but it took me forever. But I'm really happy with it, and I like it a lot, and I hope you like it too. The colours and the materials go well together, and the shape works to complement the end result. And guess what? I've ordered some more special effects paints, so you'll be seeing more of things like this. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, a thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.